Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Robert George. My day job is as a professor of jurisprudence at Princeton University, but I have the honor to be the chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is sponsoring this morning's event. USCIRF, as we call ourselves, is an independent, bipartisan federal commission which monitors religious freedom abroad and makes policy recommendations on its advancement to the President and the Congress and the Secretary of State. As the highlight of today's program, we're honored to have with us a very distinguished guest, UN High Commissioner for Refugees António Guterres. Following my introduction, the High Commissioner will deliver his remarks and then sit down for a conversation with my friend and colleague Eric Schwartz, who serves as Vice Chairman of our Commission and is himself the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. Now, our focus this morning is on the heartbreaking surge of Syrians forced to flee their homes. But it's also important, of course, to remember the truly horrifying global dimensions of the current refugee crisis, something USCIRF has been very, very concerned about. According to the High Commission's annual Global Trends Report, World at War, worldwide displacement is the highest since the Commission's creation. The number of people forcibly displaced at the end of 2014 rose to the stunning figure of 59.5 million. That's up from 50 million at the end of 2013. So you see the increase in less than 2 years is very, very alarming. Think about what it means. 1 in every 122 human beings is either a refugee, internally displaced, or seeking asylum. So how did this happen? Why so many people? Of course, many are fleeing war, many are fleeing oppression. But what's most striking from our Commission's perspective, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, is how often we find issues of religion in the mix. And in far too many cases, efforts by demagogues to gain power or hold power, maintain power, by stoking the flames of bigotry, discrimination, and sectarianism. We see these issues at play in numerous countries. In Burma, the victimized Rohingya Muslims are persecuted quite ruthlessly, resulting in more than 140,000 becoming internally displaced and thousands fleeing the country. And this is a case where it's not simply a matter of government oppression, but where cultural circumstances lead to the maltreatment of this religious minority. In Central African Republic, fighting between Christians and Muslims, between militias representing the different faith traditions, has destroyed nearly every mosque in the country and displaced nearly 1 million people. It's a tragedy, unspeakable tragedy. In Eritrea, more than 5,000 people per month continue to flee the country's brutal dictatorship, including evangelical Protestants, Pentecostals, and Jehovah's Witnesses, who are often imprisoned and even tortured for their faith. In Nigeria, Boko Haram's rampages against Christians and even Muslims who don't go along with them have displaced more than 1 million people. In Pakistan, Hindus have fled attacks by non-state actors. But of course, by far the largest source of displaced persons today is Syria, with more than 7.6 million people internally displaced and more than 4 million registered refugees living mostly in neighboring countries including Jordan, Lebanon, of course, Egypt, Iraq, and Turkey. Hundreds of thousands are making the dangerous Mediterranean crossing in search of asylum in Europe. Tens of thousands of babies of Syrian descent are now stateless, since they are ineligible for citizenship in the host countries where they were born. About 75% of Syrian refugees are women and children, and nearly 50% are under the age of 18. As USCIRF has reported, years before this crisis, President Bashar Assad's policies sowed the seeds of this tragedy. Once Syrians opposing the Assad government began peacefully demonstrating for their rights back in 2011, Assad's regime fired on them, instigating sectarianism, turning Syria's religious communities against each other or one another, and helping foster the creation of an environment in which the Islamic State and its horrors could rise and spread. As a result of the war and the terror that they were experiencing, countless Syrians fled the country. Tragically, the Islamic State, ISIL, is also responsible for egregious abuses and terror in Iraq. From Yazidis to Christians, Shia to Sunni, no religious or ethnic group has been unaffected. How tragically accurate the High Commissioner is in deeming this desperate situation a mega crisis. Behind this crisis and others like it are, we must never forget, precious human lives. Human beings from every walk of life, each possessing, we believe, infinite dignity and worth. Surely the photo of the lifeless body of the little 3-year-old boy, Alan Kurdi, drowned and discovered on a Turkish beach, drove this home, shaking us to our core. Surely we can do more to help. We must do so in at least two critical ways. First, the U.S. and our international partners should provide immediate humanitarian relief, and that means resettling more refugees. USCIRF has called on the U.S. government to raise its annual resettlement ceiling to at least 100,000. It has been 70,000 in recent years, and the administration, our administration here in Washington, recently announced it would be 85,000 for the 2016 fiscal year, including 10,000 Syrians. Now, this increase, from our point of view at USCIRF, is welcome. But given the scale of the global crisis, it's obviously not sufficient, especially if we are asking our friends in Europe and in the Middle East to do so much more. Resettlement will only be the solution for a small number of the world's refugees, no matter what we do, but it is a vital protection for the most vulnerable. My own belief is that vulnerability has got to be the basis of prioritization. And let me make what I believe is a key point about Syrian refugees. Although we can and must, here in the United States, as far as our resettlement is concerned, take the strongest possible security precautions, taking security concerns that our people raise seriously in receiving refugees, it's also time to speak out strongly against the unwarranted fear that Syrian refugees who happen to be Muslims are likely, because they're Muslims, just because they're Muslims, to be terrorists in disguise. Clearly, many Muslims, along with Christians and Yazidis, are among the victims of terrorism and tyranny. And given that there seems to be no end in sight to this crisis, we must all, not just those of us here in the United States, but globally, all of us, do a lot more long-term thinking about how to support humanitarian assistance organizations and those countries that are hosting Syrian refugees. But besides redoubling our efforts concerning the immediate humanitarian crisis, there's a second thing we need to do, and that is stand for religious freedom whenever and wherever it is under threat and assault. We need to reiterate that respect for religious freedom and other human rights and for religious, cultural, and ethnic diversity matters greatly, not just for humanitarian reasons, though it does for humanitarian reasons, but also as an antidote, as part of the effort to push back against instability and conflict. Instability and conflict of precisely the sort that is, at the end, what's behind the refugee crisis. As many studies confirm, basic human rights, including the central foundational right to religious freedom, are correlated with more, not less, social harmony and stability within nations. In other words, by standing for religious freedom, we're saying the following. The best way to solve the refugee crisis is to alleviate conditions that create refugees in the first place, the instability, the internal strife that caused the problem of refugees in the first place. And now, before I bring our very special guest, the High Commissioner, forward to speak, let me say a few words about him and about my colleague, Commissioner Schwartz, Vice Chairman Schwartz. In June of 2005, António Guterres became the 10th United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. As High Commissioner, he heads one of the world's foremost humanitarian organizations with a budget last year, or this year, 2015, of $7 billion. The UNHCR's approximately 9,300 staff members work in 123 countries, providing help to more than 55 million people who've been forced by one thing or another, one tragedy or atrocity or another, from their homes. The High Commissioner himself has more than a generation's worth of public service experience, ranging from membership in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to President of the European Council to Prime Minister of Portugal, his homeland. His commitment to assisting refugees has been unwavering throughout his career. My friend Eric Schwartz was appointed by President Obama as a USCIRF Commissioner in April of 2013 and reappointed the following year. He is Dean of the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Before that, he was the United States State Department's principal humanitarian official, serving under then Secretary of State Clinton as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. Vice Chairman Schwartz has served for some 30 years in senior positions in government at the United Nations and in the philanthropic and NGO communities. It's been my very great pleasure to work closely with him on the refugee crisis and other critical issues at USCIRF. And now I'd like you to please join me in welcoming our guest, the High Commissioner. Mr. Guterres.
Good morning, everybody. I thought what we would do is probably talk, have a conversation with the High Commissioner for about half an hour, and then open it up for questions from you all. But before I begin, I want to also welcome High Commissioner Guterres, who has been such a dynamic leader of UNHCR at a time when leadership is so critically important. He has been the United States has been a very strong supporter of his organization, and UNHCR has had a very close relationship with the United States. My successor, Ann Richards, is here. Welcome, Ann. And I was wondering whether that red phone was ever put into your office, that between PRM and you text. Okay, good. So we've had a lot of discussion about what my opening question for the High Commissioner is going to be. So I don't think he actually knows right now what the opening question is going to be. So I'm going to make it as broad as I can to give the High Commissioner the opportunity to talk for a few minutes at least. And really, it's what a mess. I mean, what a enormous challenge politically, geopolitically, in terms of basic humanitarian issues. We'll get to issues of ethnicity, religion, but why don't you just start by telling us what's going on and how and how you're trying to cope in your position with the enormous humanitarian challenges to which Robbie alluded in his opening comments.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank not only my very dear friend Eric Schwartz, but especially the chairman of the Commission for this invitation, and to say that I feel very much at home here. Religious freedom is a central pillar of any democratic state, of any human rights minded state, of any state based on the rule of law. And religious freedom is not only the right to have a religion, profess it, but also the right not to have one, and the right to change religion, which is something that is still not obvious in many parts of the world. And obviously, any form of religious persecution or discrimination is a central cause for refugee status to be granted and for refugee protection to be granted, wherever people come to, or namely through, in the case of the US, your resettlement program. So I feel very much at home being here, and this institution represents one of the central aspects of our activity. Now, what's happening? Our chairman just mentioned that we reached the highest level of displacement by conflict ever since the Second World War. But worse than that is the staggering escalation we are witnessing in the last few years. 10 years ago, the number of refugees in the world was going down. And we were hoping about 1 million people to go back home every year when I started my functions. Last year, we helped less than 150,000. And worse than that, the number of people displaced by conflict, newly displaced by conflict, has risen from 11,000 per day in 2010 to 42,500 in 2014. And it was not a matter of ups and downs. It was always rising, year after year after year. And what that means is that we live in a world where new conflicts are emerging everywhere in a way that is sometimes totally unpredictable. And at the same time, the old conflicts seem never to die. We have seen in the recent past, from the reopening of the crisis in South Sudan to Mali, Central African Republic, Nigeria, recently Burundi, the Ukraine, Iraq, the second, Yemen, and Afghanistan, Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo are still there and still very problematic. And so humanitarian suffering, the suffering of people, is on the rise, humanitarian needs are on the rise, and the capacity to respond is no longer there. We are no longer providing the core protection that people need and the basic life-saving assistance that people need at a minimum level. The international community is failing those displaced by conflict in the world, or at least a large number of them. Now, it was said by Robert George that in many of these conflicts there is a religious dimension. But I would like to say that, in my opinion, in the majority of the circumstances, this religious dimension has been artificially created by political leaders. If one looks at Syria, Syria was a society in which we worked a lot before with Iraqi refugees. In Syria, you had Sunnis, Alawites, Christians, living together, Druze living together without any problem. And all of a sudden, as it was said, the confrontation between communities was triggered. In Central African Republic, there is no story of any conflict between Muslims and Christians. And all of a sudden, it became a religious conflict between Muslims and Christians. All this because religion has been an instrument in the hands of demagogues, as you said, and political leaders that try to use it in a way to gain power, to consolidate power, or to get rid of their political opponents. And on the other hand, it is also true that we are witnessing a world with growing inequality and in which large areas of the world face very dramatic problems, not only of extreme poverty, but of a rising middle class that is facing no future for their children. Youth unemployment in a country like Tunisia, for instance, is extremely high. And the levels of education for refugees in the world only reach about 50%. And education and jobs are two essential things to give people security and perspectives in relation to the future. I recently heard a sentence saying that an idle mind is the devil's workshop. And the truth is that in societies where sometimes there seems to be no hope, there seems to be no future, forms of religious fundamentalism, like in the past the communist ideology, provide an easy answer. I mean, if God is the solution of our problems, well, it's fantastic. No, you don't need to do much more. And that is the kind of promise that organizations like Daesh and others today provide. So we see a number of problems of insecurity felt in societies, of questions of identity societies feel, incapacity of governments to deal with the social and economic problems, problems of rising inequality, generating, especially in the youth, a sense of frustration, of lack of hope, that opens their minds to simple messages that provide a simplistic approach to their problems and the problems of their societies, facilitating the level of religious extremism. And it is to a certain extent a paradox. We had recently our annual dialogue between governments, civil society, academia, on protection. The year before the last was on faith and protection, and the role of faith-based organizations, and the role of religion. And it was clear, all religions are, in relation to refugee protection, have as basic principles compassion, hospitality, protection provided to people in need. All religions. It is clear in Christianity, it is clear in Jewish faith, it is clear in Islam, it is clear in Hinduism. The Upanishads, which is one of the groups of books of Hinduism, are very strong on the hospitality to strangers in need. It is clear in the Karuna concept of Buddhism. All religions have this approach. And yet, I mean, peace is central in all religions. You say shalom, salam. I'm a Catholic. In our Mass, at a certain moment, we say to each other, peace of Christ. No, I mean, peace is central in all religions. And yet, all religions have been manipulated by extremists that pick things that are somewhere, namely in the context of a situation of millennia ago, to completely distort the religious perspective and to offer violent solutions to people. What for me has been surprising is that, well, we had the Spanish Inquisition, and there are many forms of fundamentalism in Christianity. We have the Islamic fundamentalism, that of course is well known. We have some Jewish forms of radicalism. We have Hindu fundamentalism, and now, for my surprise, Buddhist fundamentalism. And it was mentioned the situation in Myanmar, but also in Thailand to a certain extent. I mean, Buddhist fundamentalism, which means that this kind of perversion is possible in any society, and we cannot blame religion. We need to be able to blame those that use in a totally unacceptable way the distortion of religion to try to serve their own interests in the worst possible form. Now, having said so, I think we also need to underline the enormous importance of faith-based organizations in delivering assistance and protection to people all over the world. in bringing communities together. There was recently an alliance between the Lutheran World Foundation and the Islamic Relief Organization. We have seen in Central African Republic the platform, the interface platform of the several religions trying to bring people together. We have seen religious leaders from the Pope to different Protestant leaders to different Islamic religious leaders making very strong appeals for understanding the need and the importance of diversity in our societies. In Europe, where we have witnessed xenophobia being developed in several countries, namely against the flow of refugees, both the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church have been in the front line of the fight in favor of tolerance, in favor of respect for cultural diversity, understanding that diversity is a richness, not a problem. So there is a very important role that faith-based organizations and churches are having in today's world, and they are our natural allies for refugee protection. But the serious problem is that in today's world, power relations became unclear. The capacity to prevent conflicts and to timely solve them is largely absent in the international community's possibilities. And because of that, impunity and unpredictability became the name of the game. And it is difficult to foresee what's going to happen. But I think a very strong leadership is required in order to try to reverse this aspect. And if I may look at Syria, because we were so concerned. I think that there are 5 things that are essential to address the Syria crisis today. First is to make sure that those countries that have an influence on the parties to the conflict can come together. And this is, of course, the US, it's Russia, it's Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, probably the most relevant ones. And that all understand. I've seen some important contacts recently between the US and Russia on this. But I mean, to make all these countries understand that this is now became so dangerous for everybody. It became a threat. It became a threat to global peace and security, with fighters coming from everywhere and going back to their communities everywhere. That now it's vital to understand that the differences, the contradictions of interests are minor compared with this basic necessity to put an end to this conflict. And if those countries decide there is no way the Syrians will go on fighting, because they cannot fight without external support, we all know that. The second thing, which is absolutely essential, is to understand that countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey are overwhelmed. And as they are middle-income countries, they have received very little support. It is essential to change the priorities of development cooperation in the world to make sure that we mobilize much more resources in support to these host countries and in support to the communities, both refugee communities and host communities in those countries. One of the reasons why we have seen this outflow into Europe was at a certain moment the levels of assistance to refugees decreased after years in which faith and hope in a solution was being lost, and the living conditions were getting worse and worse. And another thing that I believe is essential, and that is the third thing, is for Europe to put its act together. Europe has been very dysfunctional in the way it has handled this situation. It's absolutely essential that those that come to Europe are properly received, properly assisted, and that all European countries mobilize their capacities instead of just 1 or 2 doing that. Sweden, Germany at the present moment, as you know. And force to have much more legal avenues for people to come. And that, of course, is resettlement key. And we will fully support any increase in resettlement quotas all over the world, but also in the US. It's humanitarian admission. It's visa policies. Brazil has given 20,000 visas to Syrians to come to Brazil and ask for asylum in Brazil. I mean, this is an example that there are many other ways to do family unification programs, which are essential. And unfortunately, in Europe, we are seeing some regression in some countries in relation to family unification programs. There must be legal ways for Syrians to come instead of putting themselves in the hands of smugglers and traffickers in the way that we are witnessing. And finally, having a very strong campaign within our own civil societies, promoting the values that are our civilizational values: tolerance, the understanding of the importance of diversity, and making sure that people understand And I think the United States is the proof of that. That diversity is today a fundamental asset of a society, and that all societies are becoming multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, and that is a good thing. But there is still, especially in a continent like Europe, a sense of false identity related to a reality that is no longer possible, that is sometimes making communities reject what is different, as if these would be possible in the 21st century.
Well, thank you for that. You know, he's a good guy, but you know, he doesn't have a lot of thoughts that are interconnected, and that's the problem. Obviously, that's not the problem. I want to get to the issue of the international architecture for humanitarian response, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask what I think is a maybe as fundamental a question. And that is, and you alluded to politics and diplomacy in your comments just now. We all know that well, many people in this room spend most of their time and energy on humanitarian response issues, with a keen awareness that humanitarian crises do not have humanitarian solutions. And so I'm interested in your thoughts about the architecture for international political response, and the capacity of the United States and the international community to take hold of these issues on the political, security, geopolitical level, and our capacity, or what we need to develop the capacity to address it in terms of, as I say, into the architecture for a political response.
Well, I've looked at these problems from a government perspective for a few years, and now I've looked at this problem from a humanitarian organization perspective. And one thing is clear: humanitarian organizations need to preserve the humanitarian principles and the autonomy of the humanitarian space, which means that the values of impartiality, neutrality, independence, humanity need to guide the action of humanitarian organizations on the ground. This is clear for me. I have no doubt about it. But having said so, we are not going to solve the problem. We are not even now able, because the resources are not available, to address sufficiently the humanitarian dimension of the problem. But worse than that, the solution is not humanitarian. Now, if one looks at things from the political perspective of a government, like the government of the United States, that has a leading role to perform in the world, or of an international organization like the European Union. I was just in a summit this weekend in Europe. It is clear for me more and more that you need to understand that there is no longer the possibility to have a vision that doesn't articulate the humanitarian, the development, and the security dimensions. What does that mean in concrete terms? It means, for example, looking at the Syria situation, there is no way to respond to the humanitarian needs of the Syrians, namely in the neighboring countries, if we do not have a development strategy that makes those neighboring countries a first priority in our development cooperation policy. And they are not a first priority in today's world development cooperation policy, because they are middle-income countries. Which means that we need to change the priorities that bilateral aid, I'm talking about development aid, now have, as we need to change the rules of engagement of the World Bank and other international financial organizations in order to allow for these countries to be in the first line of development assistance. Because if you look at Lebanon or Jordan, when in Lebanon you have one refugee for each 3 Lebanese, it is clear that the impact in the economy, in the society, in the education system, the health system, the water, the electricity supply, I mean, is such that you need massive massive development structural support. And it's budget support. It's just not only what we have been advocating for and working together with UN agencies and the World Bank to increase the resilience of communities. It's much more than that. It's really to have for these countries, and the same can be said about Cameroon or about Kenya and Ethiopia. These countries need to be, because of the role they play, a first priority in our development cooperation. But that development cooperation also needs to take into account that these countries are not only large refugee hosting countries, not only essential for humanitarian aid to be provided to the refugees in their territory, but they are essential pillars of stability in a world in which all conflicts are becoming more and more interlinked, and the first line of defense of our societies in relation to, for instance, international terrorism. If one looks at I would say the majority of the conflicts we have in today's world, a few escape this logic, but starting with Boko Haram in Nigeria, moving into Mali, Libya, Somalia with the Shabab, Yemen, the Sinai incidents, then Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. All these conflicts are becoming more and more interlinked. We have fighters that go from one to another, dependent on the strategies that these radical groups adopt at any moment, and depending also on the international community reacts to their movements. And they are not only interlinked among themselves, but they now are the source of the security problems of the whole world. And this is particularly true in Europe. And this is the explanation why in so many countries the question of refugee protection gets mixed with the question of terrorism. And I fully endorse what was said. Looking at Europe today, I am absolutely sure that those that would try to come from the Middle East to do some harm in Europe will not put themselves in the hands of a smuggling network to enter into a dinghy that can sink in the crossing, to then have to walk I don't know how many days, and no, they will fly not even in a low cost, in a normal airline, either with real documents or with well-forged documents. They will come in a much more comfortable way. And we are seeing that movement taking place, both of fighters and of other potential threats. And if you want to penetrate the US society, the most stupid thing would be to apply for resettlement in the US. I mean, the level of screening and of verification is such that, I mean, you should be very stupid to do it. It doesn't mean that you might not have one possible risk here or there, but if you compare with the number of people that came to the US, I mean, it's amazing that you practically do not know, or if you know, are very few examples, and the examples normally that are related to future evolution of people in the context of societies, which is a totally different question. I mean, the reason why in many European societies you have today this reaction against the newcomers is not so much linked to those newcomers, but it's linked to the integration problems they had in the migration flows of a few decades ago. If you look at a country like France, the problem is the integration of those migrants that came to France decades ago, the problem of the second generation, the questions of identity and the difficulties of integration. Those are the questions that allowed the Front National to climb. It's not the refugees coming from Syria today, but then of course everything gets mixed up in the heads of people, and that is why it is so important to keep a very strong advocacy for refugee protection and to keep refugee protection as it is in the United States. And I have a lot of admiration for the fact that I've always felt, and in 10 years coming to the Congress, to the government, I mean, this is indeed a bipartisan commitment in the US. Unfortunately, it's not the case in many European countries, where left and right get mixed into this discussion. Here it's a bipartisan, which I think is linked to DNA of the American society. But it is essential. It is essential to preserve that. And I hope that one of the aspects of the American leadership in the world should be to push for this bipartisan commitment to be shared by other societies that unfortunately are facing some crisis of identity that do not allow them to fully assume their responsibilities in the burden sharing that is necessary to address the dramatic dimension of today's displacement problems.
All right, I want to press a little bit on you talk about the critical importance of integration of humanitarian, development, political, and you also talk about the importance in humanitarian operations of sustaining the commitment to impartiality, neutrality, humanity, and independence. There's a tension there, and so what I'd like to kind of draw you out on this issue of you know, how you incorporate how you incorporate this more integrated concept of development, of diplomacy, perhaps even, you know, post-conflict recovery, humanitarianism, into the international architecture for humanitarian response. What does it mean? Does UNHCR take on these functions? How does the system, how does the world system need to change to get closer to this more integrated model?
I think we need strategic integration and smart division of labor on the ground. I think it's important, and of course states need to provide guidance, and international political organizations need to provide guidance on how can we have strategies that combine these instruments. But at the same time, we need to be able to act on the ground with a perspective of division of labor. For instance, I don't see necessarily a contradiction between the efforts that need to be done in order to bring the parties to the conflict in Syria to a solution. And that means to assume political positions, and in some aspects to be against or in favor of this or that actor on the ground, with the fact that when distributing humanitarian relief, you need to be able to do it in the whole Syrian territory, independently of who's in charge in any of the areas. And you need to be able to talk to everybody, to the government, to the opposition groups. The only limitation for me is that some of these groups do no longer want to talk to you, because they are so radical that they believe that humanitarian action in itself is an obstacle to their action. We see that in some of the most radical groups. But even, I have to say that even in countries like Somalia, it has been possible to deliver assistance in Shabaab-controlled areas. And I think it is very important to make this distinction. When delivering aid, we need to do everything we can not to let people be punished because of the nature of the groups that control the territory where they are. Obviously, in some situations, there was, as you mentioned, some tension between these two objectives. There are dilemmas you need to address. And I would say that to address those dilemmatic situations, you need to combine two things. A very strong link to the principles you consider your principles, and at the same time the common sense that is necessary to find a way to translate those principles into something that is possible to be implemented on the ground. It's not always easy. There are moments of great difficulty, to be honest, moments of great difficulty. And there are situations in which, because of the principles, you might be forced not to be in some areas, because you cannot be in those areas respecting those principles. And that means a very a very dramatic decision, because not being in those areas, you are not providing assistance to a number of people. But being there, you can be an instrument of one party to the conflict in a way that is detrimental to your basic values and also to the interests of those populations. There is no easy answer for this. I think it's important to recognize that the problem can exist in some situations and then do our best to face those situations with the best of your ability. In case of doubt, follow the principles.
That's it. I think that's a pretty good admonition for a lot of things. We'll open it up for questions in about 5 minutes, but before I want to go back to Syria, and I've been thinking about how to articulate this question. I'd like if you could spell out for us a reasonably optimistic and a realistically optimistic scenario over the next year or two with respect to the crisis in Syria and Syrian refugees, including, what becomes of 4 to 5 million refugees and 7 million or internally displaced persons. Part of the reason I'm asking this question is because your answer, I think, could send some signals in terms of your view about what the international community should be doing by way of equipping itself to deal with this population of displaced.
Well, first of all, will it be possible to bring together now or in the near future those countries that are key, because they are the main stakeholders in relation to the conflict? And I mentioned US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran and Turkey, but we can say Egypt or Qatar are also relevant in this context. But are these countries, and of course I have no doubt about the US, but are all these countries ready to understand that they have more to lose than to win in maintaining the status quo? The question for me is not to make people being very nice. No, the question is to make people understand what their interests really are, according to our own belief. And I think now it's the interest of all the key stakeholders to stop this nonsense, because it became a danger to everybody. Even an existential danger to some of them, I mean, more directly involved in the conflict. And this is what I believe I would like to see the US assuming a leadership role in trying to create these conditions, even if we know that there is no guarantee that this will be possible. The second thing that I think it's essential at the present moment is to make a massive investment in the neighboring countries. First, to avoid them to fall like a piece of the domino. I mean, Lebanon. We are all aware how Lebanon is fragile because of its location, because of the link between what's happening in Syria and what's happening in Lebanon, because of the dramatic impact in the economy, in the society, the difficulties of the Lebanese political process. Lebanon needs a massive support, and this massive support has been denied. And I think the international community needs to understand that. I mean, the investment that is required is very little compared with, for instance, all the amounts that are spent in relation to military interventions everywhere. So this is, in my opinion, absolutely crucial. And these could allow a negotiation with Turkey, with Lebanon and Jordan, to also improve the conditions in which refugees can have access, more limited or more open to the labor market, and to make sure that all refugee children go to school. I mean, these two things for me are essential if we want to preserve this generation from the enormous risk the influence of the more radical groups. And again, this requires a strong U.S. leadership, because this requires the mobilization of resources that are, I would say, there is a quantum leap that needs to be put in place, and it's not humanitarian aid. It's the combination of humanitarian development aid plus the work of international financial organizations. These two things, I think, are absolutely crucial. If these two things fail, everything else will be, I mean, just trying to put a band-aid in a wound made by a sword. No, I mean, I mean, everything else. Of course, the resettlement program is very important, and we'll be encouraging it. But we are always talking of a minority of the people involved. Whatever can be done in improving humanitarian aid by, for instance, we are now increasing from 25,000 families to 30,000 families the number of refugee families in Jordan that receive our monthly cash grant. That is a cash grant given to the most vulnerable of the families. And we were able now, with this spike in interest of international community and more resources that we receive, so we are moving from 25,000 to 50,000. And we are moving this support to what corresponds more or less to $1 per person per day. I mean, let's be honest, it's miserable, no? But that's what we can do. So, I mean, we can move from 30,000 to 35,000, from $1 to 1.25. I mean, we can give as many aspirins as possible to the patient, but the patient needs a surgery.
Yeah. Thank you. Why don't we open it up to questions? I see a number of hands have shot up. Yes? I don't know. Could you also, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, that would be great.
Thank you very much. I'm Barbara Slavin. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and I also write for the Al Monitor website. Sir, you've talked a lot about U.S. leadership and what the U.S. needs to do, but a lot of the refugees who are fleeing now are fleeing bombardment by Russia in Syria. Do you have any advice for the Russian government in terms of its recent actions, particularly in Syria? Thank you.
No, it was very clear for me that if you don't bring together the US, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey to come to a common understanding on how to stop this will never end. So it is obvious for me that Russia is also a key element in the solution that is required.
Yes?
Yeah, I'm Ben Barber. I write for Huffington Post. Do you believe that the decision to intercept the refugee boats in the Mediterranean and bring those people to Italy and to Europe created a magnet that has spurred the flow of refugees?
The numbers prove that that pull effect was not true. If you remember, we had, and I'm talking about Italy now because that was, it is possible to measure things and it's where things are more obvious. We had the Mare Nostrum operation in 2014. And the Mare Nostrum operation was an operation that was managed and implemented by the Italian Coast Guard, picking people from the Libyan waters, people that were in those awful boats, risking to sink, and bringing them into Italy. And indeed, many people said that this was a pull effect, this was creating refugee flows and migrants flows, because in the Central Mediterranean it's a more mixed bag. In Eastern it's more refugee kind of movement, in the Central is a more mixed refugee and migrant kind of movement. And that led, as you remember, to the Mare Nostrum being ending in the end of 2014 and being replaced by a much smaller operation led by Frontex that was aiming essentially at the protection of the coast and less at the rescue at sea. Now, paradoxically, the numbers in 2015 in that period have increased in relation to 2014. And of course, the number of deaths has increased quite dramatically in the beginning of 2015. So the fact that Mare Nostrum ended did not stop anything. And then, with the scandal created by this large increase in the number of people dying, as you know, there was a decision to have a more robust rescue and sea operation in the Central Mediterranean that now is assumed by a number of countries and basically has replaced the Mare Nostrum capacity. And paradoxically, the number of people coming into Italy is now not larger than what it was last year, which means that there was no connection between the capacity of rescue at sea and the number of people moving. I'm talking about the analysis of the facts, which can be explained because most of these movements are not movements out of hope, but they are out of despair. Most of these people are fleeing extremely dramatic circumstances, and if there is an opportunity to risk their lives, they will risk their lives to try to reach a solution for their plight. I spoke with many Syrian refugees, namely women, about that, and they were telling me, I mean, imagine a Syrian woman with children, husband was killed, the children are not at school, or very few of them are at school. She has not a job. The level of assistance is minimal. And then, I mean, she has some savings. And what is the most rational use for those savings? To spend them until they disappear, or to try to buy one of these, I mean, horrible in the way it is organized, and I mean it's a form of exploitation that is absolutely terrible. But for the person, it's to risk everything in one crossing, and if it works, there will be a future for her and for the children. And they were telling me, we are already dead. We prefer to risk our lives than to go on dead where we are.
If I can just, comment, since this is a conversation, not a press conference. I mean, I think any government can deter movements. You can do it if you create obstacles that are significant and substantial enough, fear of injury, fear of death, you can deter movement. But the ethical issues surrounding migration management, when people are fleeing for their lives, the ethical issues are profound and compelling. And if you don't recognize that, then I think you're missing something that's absolutely critical in this discussion. I had this gentleman, and then I'll have Nina, right? Yeah, and then this gentleman in the corner.
Thank you. My name is Andrei Sitov. I am a Russian reporter here in Washington, D.C. Thank you, sir, for coming over, and thanks to the Commission for hosting the event. I'm glad to say that in Russia we have a huge religious revival over the past few years. I hope Americans keep their own religious roots and values. Sir, my question to you is, I was listening to your ideas on how to resolve, especially the Syrian situation, and I was thinking this is basically what the Russians have been proposing all along, that grand coalition of countries, including Iran and Egypt and others. But the big difference, obviously, is the fate of Assad and his government. And we all know that the Americans want Assad to go, and we all know that the Russians want Assad to stay. But there's a bigger question. Basically, the reasoning that we hear from Moscow is that all the political transitions, quote unquote, or regime changes, as other people call them, we have seen in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. My question is, have all those been beneficial from your vantage point, from where you look at it? And at this point, what should be our biggest priority? Political transitions or regime changes, or coming together and using all resources, including the resources of the regimes, to fight the common threat? Thank you.
Well, we are entering in the center of the political debate, which is not my area. No, I'm not even allowed to enter into these details. But I would say one thing only. It is always easy to argue when we don't want a solution. No, I've been part of many negotiations in my life. No, and political negotiations of different sorts. No? And there is always an excellent argument not to make an agreement. No, it's so simple. The question for me is not the formula. I think the formula is irrelevant from this point of view. The question for me is, are the parties that are relevant to this conflict already convinced that the risks they all face are so big that they are more important than the differences among them or not? If they are convinced, a solution is possible. If they are not convinced, there will always be good arguments not to come to an agreement. No, I mean, my belief, my sincere belief, looking at that tragedy and the implications of that tragedy for everybody, my sincere belief is that it is a suicide to let this war go on.
Nina.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm Nina Shea, and I direct the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, but I was a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for 12 years. So my question pertains to the minorities, refugees in Syria, or coming from Syria. Pope Francis has said that the Christians there are facing genocide from extremist groups, and Yazidi leaders have said the same thing. Yet the United States has received, in refugee resettlement from the UN, a grand total of 53 Christians and 1 Yazidi in the entire 5 years of the conflict in Syria. And when I asked the State Department about this, I was told that it's because they're not registering as refugees, that they either don't know about the process or can't get access to it. Part of the reason is that these minorities avoid the UN camps because they see them as dangerous, and the British press has had some pieces on that just in the last week. So my question is, I know that the UNHCR does not discriminate on the basis of religion, but sometimes not to discriminate is to discriminate because these minorities are so marginalized. So I want to ask you, what can you do about this, and what can we all do about this?
Well, we do not discriminate on the basis of religion, but we consider that the fact that you belong to a religious minority is an important element of vulnerability, and we apply a vulnerability criterion, which means that the fact that you belong to a religious minority, especially if that religious minority is threatened, is obviously one of the criteria that we apply in the choice of people in need of protection through resettlement. And the truth is that if you remember the number of Syrians resettled into the US until now, as far as I understand, we are talking about 2,000 people that came. No, we are small. It's difficult to have statistics based on small numbers, because when you have statistics based on small numbers, you sometimes miss the perspective. But we had a long experience of resettlement of Iraqis, yes? And if you consider the resettlement of Iraqis, where the situation of Christians is more dramatic than in Syria, from the point of view of, I mean, the Syrians were a higher percentage in, the Christians are a higher percentage in Syria than in Iraq, and they have been less systematically victimized than they were in Iraq. But if you look at the percentage of Christians in the resettlement from Iraq, it is higher than the percentage of Christians in the refugees, which is normal because the fact they were Christians or Sabians or other minorities was in itself a factor of vulnerability. In relation to the Syrian situation, there is a more complex issue, which is the following. most of the Syrian Christians have moved to Lebanon. And in Lebanon, the first thing that has happened to me when I met the Lebanese president, it was not, now there is no president, so the former president, when I asked him to start a resettlement program from Lebanon, don't resettle Christians because they are vital for us, which means that for the Lebanese society, there is a strong interest in preserving the Christians in Lebanon. Having said so, I fully agree that clearly in the Iraq situation and in some areas of the Syria situation, the fact that you are a Christian is in itself a factor of vulnerability. I would say even more for Yazidis, because Yazidis are not one of the peoples of the book, and not being a people of the book, they can be, as you know, victims of these completely, horrendous interpretations of Islam that Daesh has about slavery and things of the sort, that are things that are completely, impossible to understand in the 21st century. So it is clear for me that a policy of non-discrimination can only be adopted if we recognize the vulnerability that corresponds that you are a member of a minority. But allow me to speak here also as a Christian, which I probably shouldn't.
You're permitted.
I must say that I'm worried about what's happening in the Middle East. People in my country, and of course I cannot mention the United States because it's a young nation, except for the populations that were here already long ago. But in my country, people were still worshipping the trees and the rivers. And the Christians in the Middle East, in Alexandria, in Antioch, in Caesarea, Kayseri now in Turkey, they were discussing whether the Holy Ghost was coming from the Father or from the Father and the Son. And most of the most important theological discussions of the beginning of Christianity were, I know that in Milan played a role, and even Rome, but more Milan than Rome, but most of those discussions were in that part of the world. That is where Christianity was born. And to see those communities the risk of being eradicated from that area is something that I consider with horror. So independently of the importance of the resettlement program, I think that the international community must do everything possible to create the conditions for these communities to be able not to be, now it's religiously cleansed, from that part of the world. That would be, to really do an amputation in the DNA of Christianity and in the DNA of the Middle East. This has nothing to do with the support to individuals that need resettlement. But we need also to mobilize the efforts of the international community in order to preserve those communities that are in the very origin of Christianity as Christianity exists today. I shouldn't probably be so Christian on this.
I think it was a profound
thought it was,
point.
because this is something I feel very strongly.
I appreciate your making it. Before we get to the next question, I want to make a point on resettlement. You once said something at a forum, at a public meeting in Geneva, that I said I would never repeat in Washington because it wouldn't do the State Department, the humanitarians and government any good. But I'm going to repeat it anyway because I'm not the Assistant Secretary anymore. And what you said was, the reason you admire the humanitarians in the U.S. government so much is because sometimes they're prepared to take decisions without regard to narrow national security interests. And I don't think you were saying that American humanitarian officials are disloyal. I hope you weren't saying that. But I think what you were saying was that the principles of impartiality, humanity, neutrality, independence guide the work and ultimately, frankly, serve American interests in very profound ways. And I think the U.S. resettlement program is, the evolution of that program is an example of that, because now, resettlement is only going to be a tool of choice for tiny minority of the world's refugees. And over many, many years, the U.S. program has really evolved in ways that are now working much more closely with the international humanitarian organizations and taking guidance from the international humanitarian organizations on issues of vulnerability and who should be resettled. And that's the direction that, you know, in terms of the question that Nina asks, that is the direction that national government should be going if the international community is going to be making very hard decisions on who to resettle and, by implication, who not to resettle.
I had to say.
Follow up with one point.
Yeah,
sure.
Following Anina's point, you made the point about your discussions with the Lebanese leadership wanting to not resettle their Christians. Can you say anything about the situation for those Christians who will not be resettled on the ground in Lebanon as far as their employment situation and their other circumstances? What is the Lebanese government doing? How are they handling that?
Let's be clear. The Lebanese capacity of effective integration is very limited. So all Syrian refugees, including the Christians, but probably a little bit better for the Christians than for others, but all Syrian refugees in Lebanon live in an extremely difficult economic situation. That is true. Which means, that's why I was saying, on one side, we need to look at individual situations, and based on that individual situations, we need to accept that we have to resettle people. On the other side, I feel that if we have a misguided policy on these, we can create an irreversible loss in a region that I would like not to happen. But this is not a criterion I can use when I do individual resettlement of people. I mean, this is just a feeling I have about the future of that region. There is another thing. Some time ago, I had to say something very usually moderate in the way I express myself, because I mean I've always been in politics left of center, but center left. You know, and so and I think that it's not because you speak in a very tough way that you get what is important. But I had to say that when some European governments were saying that they would only be ready to accept non-Muslim refugees, I said this is the best propaganda you can make to Daesh. Because this is to give Daesh the argument to say that what we are doing is justified because it's against the Crusaders and what, you know, these horrible things that they say. So I think it's very important. And this is not a problem in the US, essentially. It's a problem in Europe. But in Europe is a decisive question, also because of the past colonial relations and the complexity of all these things. I think Europe needs to be very careful in what it is said about the refugees from the region, and to make sure that there is a totally non-discrimination in relation to religion in that regard.
I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I wouldn't say the challenge here is non-existent. It's a challenge here to address the, you know, these sorts of concerns about discrimination and bigotry, and I think we need to be constantly vigilant about it here as well. There was a question from did you have a question? Yes, please.
Thanks for the event and the opportunity to ask a question. I'm Akbar Shahid Ahmed, also from the Huffington Post, and I wanted to ask about what you started with, and this is a question both for the UNHCR and for the Commission, specifically on what Syria used to be and what it's become in terms of religious freedom and diversity being targeted. We're hearing reports of both sides, whether it's Iran-linked militias attacking Sunni Arab areas or Sunni Arab extremists like ISIS attacking areas where minorities have been. What specific reports can you confirm of actors in Syria targeting religious minorities and formerly diverse areas? And is that irreversible?
No, I think that clearly in the Syria-Iraq context, you have victims among Sunnis, among Shia, among Christians, among Yazidis, among all groups in different circumstances, depending on where things happen. are victims. I mean, Sunnis made the large part of the victims in Anbar, no? Of the events, the recent events in Anbar. Before, I remember the drama of Shia minorities in the Turkmen Shia, for instance, in northern Iraq, when Daesh entered. I mean, so all communities have been victimized. I would say that those that were more horrendous, for me, was what happened with the Yazidis, and especially with the Yazidi women, I mean, and children, and this absolutely inconceivable concept of the legitimacy of slavery for sexual purposes. I mean, that was put into place against that community, if you remember. I mean, that for me is, I mean, how is it possible to have this horror in the 21st century? But having said so, we have detected situations in which all communities, in different ways, have been victimized. The difference, especially in Iraq, more than in Syria, is that in Iraq, at a certain moment, there was no area of the territory in which these communities could be safe. No. Because they would be in trouble anywhere. To use our technical, the internal flight alternative would not exist. I think in Syria it is less dramatic than in Iraq, but that it was in Iraq, but you still have terrible situations taking place.
Sure, Katrina.
Thank you very much. Katrina Lantos-Sweat, also a member of USCIRF, and I want to thank my colleagues and especially the High Commissioner for this fantastic event today. You said earlier, both of you, that to these humanitarian crises, there are not exclusively humanitarian solutions. I'd like you to address, if you would, the potential political implications, particularly in Europe, of the fear and to some degree suspicion that we see on the part of the population, perhaps a certain alienation amongst the general population from the views of the elites. We've seen some recent elections in which there seems to be a significant increase in support for not just center-right but far-right parties that are running quite explicitly on platforms that play upon these fears and suspicions and anxieties of the existing populations in Europe. How do you see this political evolution playing out, and how does Europe in particular defend the civilization values you spoke about so eloquently at a time when populations in democratic societies are voting in ways that reflect their fear and their concern?
We are talking about 700,000 people that came to a European Union of 550 million. No. In Lebanon, we have one refugee for each 3 Lebanese. I mean, we are talking of a problem that could be manageable, but there is an essential condition for something to be manageable, that it is managed. And what happened in Europe was total chaos. Right. No? People coming into Greek islands where nothing was ready to receive them, moving then into mainland Greece, and then going all the way through the Balkans in a way in which populations got the idea that nobody's in charge, that things are out of control. And this, in my opinion, is what really changed some sectors of European public opinion. So it's just not that the fact that you have a group coming orderly into the country, is this idea that you have an invasion that nobody controls, that these people are coming in big numbers, and what's going to happen, and all of a sudden we are going to be submerged. No. Now, that is why we have, since the beginning, we have said what you need is to control the flow at entry point. You need to have a huge reception capacity to be put in place in the Greek islands and in the mainland, to have a massive relocation program distributing these people through the different European countries in an organized way, and then doing refugee status determination, or for those that, I mean, are obviously refugees, creating a mechanism of integration. And if you look at a country like Portugal, the number that was attributed to Portugal by this relocation program was 4,000. I mean, so if this was properly organized, there wouldn't be any of these feelings. Now, what people see on television every day is thousands of people coming, and obviously, basically, as nothing is organized, going into just 2 or 3 countries, and obviously this generates a feeling of insecurity. So, I mean, this needs to be properly organized. And the drama is that the European Union has been so divided that everything has been done too little, too late. And at the same time, those that try to use this for political purposes from the point of view of populist approaches are gaining ground now. And those that are essentially motivated by compassion and solidarity have sometimes more difficulties because the public opinion is sensitive to this chaotic way in which the movement takes place.
Well, it's thank you. It's 11:30, so we're going to close. But before we do, I just have to note that this is indeed your last visit to the United States as High Commissioner, so far as I can tell.
No, I'll be next week in New York.
Oh, all right. Well, is this your last visit to? Is it your last visit to Washington?
I will come to Washington.
Is it your last visit? Hang on, stick with me. Is it your last visit to the National Press Club?
Yes.
Okay. So, as this is your last visit to the National Press Club, and as you will be shortly departing office, I think we have to thank you for your leadership. I think at a time in which the world is going in so many different directions, we're in a period of transition. We're not sure what that transition means. You know, I can think of nothing more important than to have leaders of international institutions who combine dynamism, a sense of mission, values, and a capacity to get things done. I can't think of a time in history where it's more important to have leaders of our international organizations who have all those qualities, and you certainly have those qualities. We're deeply, deeply grateful for your service, and we look forward to many years of continued service in some other capacity. So thank you, António Guterres, for joining us.
And before I ask you to join me in thanking the High Commissioner and the Vice Chairman for that excellent and informative presentation, I want to take a moment to thank the wonderful staff of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, many of whose members are here, under the terrific leadership of Ambassador Jacqueline Wolcott, who is our Executive Director. We are truly blessed with a terrific staff, a small staff that does an enormous amount of good on this critically important issue of international religious freedom. We have some of our materials out here, including our 2015 annual report. We hope that you'll take advantage of the opportunity to pick one up and look at our other materials. We're available to you, of course, if you need us. And now please do join me in thanking Vice Chairman Schwartz and the High Commissioner. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Yes, thank you.